There is a particular kind of silence that only comes after everything falls apart. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind you choose. The kind that wraps around you like cold water, still, heavy, and completely suffocating. That was the silence surrounding a woman named Vivian Cole on what was supposed to be the greatest night of her life. She was 43 years old, dressed in $4,000 worth of ivory satin and hand-stitched lace, sitting completely alone at a city bus stop on a Thursday night in the middle of October while rain came down in heavy, unforgiving sheets around her. Her veil was soaked through. Her bouquet of white peonies, flowers she had personally chosen 6 months ago, lay on the bench beside her, slowly being destroyed by the water. She wasn't crying. That was the part nobody who passed by that night could quite understand. A woman in a wedding dress, alone in the rain, at 11:47 at night, and not a single tear on her face. Just that silence. She had been sitting there for 22 minutes when the headlights appeared. A sleek black car moving slowly through the flooded street. The kind of car that does not belong anywhere near a public bus stop in a storm. It slowed. It stopped. The engine did not cut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the rain hammering the roof of that car and the water rushing along the gutter at Vivian's feet. Then the driver's side window came down, and a man looked out at her. He was somewhere in his early 50s, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had clearly carried a great deal of weight for a very long time. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not rush out with an umbrella or make a scene. He simply looked at her for a moment and said, in a voice that was quiet and steady and completely without pity, "The last bus on this route already came. It's not coming back tonight." Vivian looked at him. "I know," she said, and she turned back to face the rain. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Vivian Cole was not a woman who made reckless decisions. If anything, the people who knew her best would have described her as the most careful, most steady, most quietly reliable person they had ever met. She had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the middle child of a schoolteacher and a retired postal worker, in a household where money was always tight, but love was never in short supply. She had paid her own way through nursing school, working double shifts at a grocery store on weekends, and studying by the light of a desk lamp long after everyone else in her building had gone to sleep. By the time she was 27, she was a registered nurse. By 32, she had built a reputation at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Nashville as one of the most trusted nurses in the entire palliative care unit. She was the kind of nurse that families specifically requested, the one who stayed late without being asked, who remembered the names of patients' grandchildren, who held a dying man's hand at 2 in the morning and talked to him softly about baseball until he was gone. She gave everything to the people around her and had spent so many years doing it that somewhere along the way, she had quietly stopped asking whether anyone was doing the same for her. That was the honest truth about Vivian Cole that none of her coworkers, none of her friends, and certainly not the man she had agreed to marry would ever fully grasp until it was far too late. She had learned, somewhere in the long years of her life, to need very little, to take up very little space, to be grateful for whatever warmth was extended in her direction and never, never ask for more than what was offered. It was both her greatest gift and the wound she had been quietly bleeding from for as long as she could remember. His name was Daniel Whitfield. She had met him at a hospital fundraiser 7 years before that rainy October night. He was a real estate developer. Handsome in the way that certain men are, the kind of handsome that comes from confidence rather than structure, from the ease with which a man moves through a room when he has never once doubted his right to be in it. He had walked up to her at the fundraiser with a glass of wine and a smile, and said, "You look like the only honest person in this building." And Vivian, who had spent the entire evening standing slightly apart from the crowd, because that was what she always did, had laughed in spite of herself. That was how it started. And for a long time, for a genuinely long time, it was good. He was charming and attentive in the early years. He remembered things she mentioned in passing, a book she wanted, a restaurant she'd heard about, a weekend she'd mentioned needing. He made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like someone was actually paying attention to her. And Vivian, who had spent so many years being the one who paid attention to everyone else, found that feeling to be almost overwhelmingly powerful. She fell deeply, completely in love with him. By the time the cracks began to show, the canceled plans, the excuses, the gradual way his attention began to slide from her and toward other things, other evenings she was not part of. She was already so committed to the relationship, so personally invested in the idea of who they were together, that she did what careful, steady, reliable women so often do. She adjusted. She gave him more space. She asked fewer questions. She told herself that this was simply what long relationships looked like. That passion softened into partnership and partnership into routine and routine into a kind of quiet comfort that was, she convinced herself, enough. His proposal had come 18 months before the wedding, on a Sunday morning in their kitchen. No grand gesture, no restaurant, no ring box he'd been hiding for weeks. He had simply looked up from his coffee and said, "We should probably just go ahead and get married." And Vivian, God help her, had said yes. Not because it swept her off her feet, but because she loved him and she was 41 years old and she was tired of waiting for the version of her life she had imagined. And this steady, familiar, imperfect thing, felt like as close to it as she was ever going to get. The wedding was set for a Saturday evening at the Whitmore House, a historic venue outside Nashville with white columns and magnolia trees and a garden that turned gold in October. Vivian had planned most of it herself, in the hours between shifts and on her days off, with the methodical patience that defined everything she did. The flowers, the seating, the music, the menu. She had made every decision carefully and thoughtfully, because that was how she did things. Her maid of honor, a woman named Cheryl Odom, had been her closest friend since nursing school. They had been through everything together: failed relationships, career setbacks, a cross-country move Vivian had eventually reversed, the death of Vivian's mother 4 years earlier. Cheryl was the one person in Vivian's life who knew her completely, or so Vivian had believed. The morning of the wedding, Vivian was in the bridal suite at the Whitmore House, getting her hair finished, when Cheryl excused herself to take a phone call. She was gone for 11 minutes. When she came back, she seemed perfectly composed, laughing, fixing Vivian's veil, making jokes about the caterer. But she had left her phone on the vanity counter when she stepped out, and a notification had come through while she was gone. Vivian had not been looking for it. She had simply reached across the counter to pass a bobby pin to the hairdresser, and the screen had lit up in her peripheral vision, and she had glanced at it without thinking, the way a person glances at anything when it lights up in a quiet room. What she saw in that single glance was a text message, visible in the notification preview, sent to Cheryl from a name she recognized. Daniel's name. A text she wished immediately that she could unsee. She did not react. She did not make a sound. She had spent 20 years working in palliative care, which means she had spent 20 years learning to hold herself completely still in moments of unbearable shock, to take the information in front of her and keep breathing and keep functioning, because the people around her needed her to. She picked up the bobby pin. She passed it to the hairdresser. She looked at herself in the mirror and felt something, some fundamental, structural thing inside her chest, quietly and permanently give way. She excused herself 5 minutes later to use the restroom. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bathtub in her wedding dress, and she read the full thread on Cheryl's phone, which she had picked up without knowing she was going to do it. And she learned, in the span of about 4 minutes, that her best friend of 15 years had been sleeping with her fiancé for the better part of 8 months. The texts were not ambiguous. There was no innocent explanation to reach for, no context that would have softened the picture. They were detailed and frequent, and laced with a casualness that told Vivian this was not a moment of weakness or a single terrible mistake. It was a relationship. It had a history, a language, a rhythm. They made plans in those messages. They talked about her, about Vivian, in those messages. Not cruelly, not with obvious contempt, but in the distracted, dismissive way that people talk about an inconvenient detail that needs to be managed. She was a logistical problem in her own love story. She set the phone down on the edge of the sink. She sat back on the edge of the bathtub, and she stayed there for 34 minutes while, 50 feet away in the bridal suite, Cheryl Odom was telling the hairdresser a funny story about a bachelorette party. When Vivian finally stood up and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, she made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that involves confrontation or announcements or scenes. She had never been that kind of person, and she was not about to become one at the lowest point of her life. She simply decided that she was not going to walk down that aisle. She was not going to stand in front of 200 people and say vows to a man she now understood had been lying to her face while her best friend stood beside her in a coral bridesmaid dress and watched. She was going to leave, quietly, the same way she had always done everything. She unlocked the bathroom door. She walked calmly through the bridal suite, said she needed a moment of air, slipped out the side door of the Whitmore house, walked to the end of the gravel drive, turned left onto the main road, and kept walking. In her wedding dress, in heels, in the October rain that had started 20 minutes earlier and showed no sign of stopping. She walked for almost a mile before she reached the bus stop on Greenfield Avenue. She sat down on the bench, and she waited for a bus that, as it turned out, had already made its last run of the night. Elliot Graves was 52 years old and had not had a genuinely peaceful evening in longer than he could accurately remember. He was the founder and chief executive of Graves Logistics Group, a supply chain and transportation company he had built from a single leased warehouse in Memphis when he was 29 years old into a multi-state operation with over 4,000 employees and contracts with some of the largest retailers in the country. He was, by any measurable standard, extraordinarily successful. He was also, by any honest standard, extraordinarily tired. Not in the physical way, though that was also true. In the deeper way, the way that accumulates when a man has spent 2 decades building things and realizes, somewhere around the 50-year mark, that he has been so focused on the building that he forgot to actually live inside any of it. He had been married once, years before. Her name was Margaret, and she had been warm and funny and completely unimpressed by his ambitions in the way that only the right people ever are. They had been happy, genuinely happy, for the 9 years they had together. Then she got sick. A diagnosis that came in March and took her by November, moving through her with a speed and brutality that left Elliot standing at a graveside in the December cold, feeling like the ground beneath his feet had simply ceased to be solid and would likely never be solid again. He had thrown himself back into work after that, not because work healed him, but because it was the only structure available, and structure was the only thing keeping him functional. In the 4 years since Margaret's death, he had expanded the company, increased revenue, accepted 2 industry awards, and had not once, not on a single occasion, allowed himself to sit still long enough to feel the full weight of what he had lost. He was very good at not sitting still. He had made it almost an art form. On the night he found Vivian Cole at the bus stop on Greenfield Avenue, he had been driving back from a board meeting that had run until nearly 11 o'clock, a contentious session about a potential acquisition he had reservations about, but had ultimately greenlit because the numbers made sense and the numbers were, increasingly, the only language he still fully trusted. He was not in a particularly reflective mood. He was tired and slightly frustrated and thinking about a conference call he had at 7 the next morning when his headlights swept across the bus stop and he saw her, a woman in a wedding dress, sitting completely alone in the pouring rain, her hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for something she had long since stopped expecting to arrive. He slowed the car without consciously deciding to. He stopped. He sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to arrive at a reasonable explanation for what he was looking at. There wasn't one. He rolled down his window and told her the last bus had already come. She told him she knew. He sat with that for a moment. Then he turned the engine off, got out of the car, opened the back door, retrieved the umbrella he kept there out of long habit, walked to the bus stop, and sat down beside her on the bench. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer advice or comfort or well-meaning platitudes. He simply opened the umbrella over both of them and watched the rain fall on the empty street and said nothing at all. That silence lasted for almost 10 full minutes. In his experience, and he had considerable experience with grief, with shock, with the particular aftermath of moments that rearrange a person's life without their permission, the worst thing another human being could do in a moment like that was to speak. To try to fill the silence with words, as though silence itself were the problem. The silence was not the problem. The silence was the only honest thing available. So he sat in it with her. And eventually, when she was ready, not a moment before, Vivian Cole spoke first. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said, not dramatically, not with a trembling voice, but plainly, the way a person states a fact they have been sitting alone with long enough that it no longer shocks them. "I had a place," she continued, looking straight ahead at the rain. "I just don't have it anymore." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "Do you have family nearby?" She shook her head. My sister's in Cleveland. My father passed 3 years ago. Another silence. All right, he said. Then let's get you somewhere dry. He drove her to a hotel on the east side of Nashville. Not the most expensive property in the city, not the kind of place designed to impress. A clean, quiet, well-lit hotel with a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and where the woman at the front desk did not visibly react to the fact that the guest checking in was wearing a soaking wet wedding dress. Elliot paid for 3 nights without discussion, left his card at the desk, and handed Vivian a key card in the elevator. He did not suggest she should be grateful. He did not extract a promise to repay him or a phone number or any form of currency for the gesture. He handed her the key and said, "The restaurant here does breakfast until 10. You should eat something tomorrow." The elevator opened on her floor. She stepped out. She turned back to look at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you needed somewhere to go," he said simply. "And I happen to have the means to help." The elevator doors closed. She stood in the hotel corridor for a long moment after the doors shut, holding a key card in her hand and still wearing $4,000 worth of soaked ivory satin, and she could not explain, not then, and not for a long time afterward, why that answer affected her so profoundly. Not because it was romantic. It was not romantic. It was simply decent. Straightforwardly, uncomplicatedly decent. And Vivian, who had spent 7 years with a man who could not even summon decency toward her on the night before their wedding, felt the full significance of that contrast land somewhere deep in her chest with a weight she was not prepared for. She did not sleep well that night. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed in a borrowed bathrobe and stared at the window and let the full reality of the day move through her the way you have to let things move through you when there is no longer any reason to hold them back. The wedding that would not happen. The guests who were probably still at the Whitmore house right now, confused and uncomfortable and full of food and opinions. Daniel, who she imagined had eventually figured out she was gone and was currently doing the mental calculations of a man whose careful double life had just collapsed. And Cheryl, who had been her friend since they were both 26 years old and frightened, and sharing a terrible apartment near the nursing school in Louisville, who had held Vivian's hand at her mother's funeral, who had called her every birthday for 15 years without exception. Vivian thought about Cheryl for a very long time that night. And then, at some point in the early hours of the morning, she stopped. Not because she had forgiven her, but because she understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that she was done. Done with the relationship. Done with the friendship. Done with the version of her life she had been carefully, faithfully, quietly building, because it had been built on ground that was never as solid as she thought. She was going to have to start from somewhere new. She did not know yet where that somewhere was. But for the first time that night, the thought of it did not feel entirely like loss. Vivian did not see Elliot Graves again for 11 days. In that time, she had returned to work, back to the palliative care unit at St. Catherine's, back to the rhythms of a job that required her to be present and focused and completely useful, which was exactly what she needed. She had called her sister in Cleveland. She had arranged to have her things moved out of the apartment she had shared with Daniel, doing so with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, requesting assistance from a moving company on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew he had a site visit out of town. She had spoken to Daniel exactly once. A brief, almost eerily calm conversation in which he cycled through remorse and excuses and finally a kind of defensive justification she had no interest in engaging with. She told him she wished him well and meant it, in the flat, exhausted way that a person means something when they are simply too tired to feel anything else. She was 3 days back at work when the hospital director sent an announcement to the nursing staff that the palliative care wing was receiving a major donation, a privately funded renovation that would expand the unit by nearly 30%, adding 6 new patient rooms, a family lounge, and a dedicated quiet garden for patients and their loved ones. The funding came from a private charitable foundation. The director said the foundation's representative would be visiting the following Thursday for a tour of the existing wing. It was standard. These visits happened periodically. Vivian had participated in half a dozen of them over the years. A tour, a brief meeting with the benefactor, a handshake, some photographs for the foundation's annual report. She noted it in her schedule and thought nothing more about it. On Thursday morning, she was finishing her notes at the nurse's station when she heard the elevator open down the hall and the hospital director's voice carrying along the corridor, warm and effusive in the specific way that directors become when significant money is walking alongside them. She looked up, and Elliot Graves walked around the corner in a charcoal suit, his hands clasped behind his back, listening to the director with the patient, quietly attentive expression of a man who genuinely wanted to understand what he was looking at. He saw her at almost the exact moment she saw him. Something shifted in his face, a controlled, barely perceptible shift, visible only because she was already looking directly at him when it happened. He did not miss a step. He continued his conversation with the director. He came to the nurse's station as part of the tour, was introduced to the staff, and extended his hand to Vivian with the composed, professional courtesy of a man meeting a colleague for the first time. "Elliot Graves," he said, "thank you for the work you do here." "Vivian Cole," she replied. "Thank you for the support." He moved on with the tour. She stood at the nurse's station and stared at her paperwork for several seconds without reading a word of it. The director returned him to the elevator at the end of the visit. And as he passed the nurse's station a second time, Elliot slowed almost imperceptibly, just enough to make eye contact with her for one brief, quiet moment, and said, in a voice too low for anyone else to catch, "How's the coffee here compared to the diner?" He kept walking. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in, and Vivian Cole stood at the nurse's station with a question she had not expected to be feeling, trying to decide whether this was fate or something she should be far more careful about. Over the days that followed, he came back. Not every day, nothing so obvious, but with a regularity that began to acquire its own pattern, the way things do when they are becoming something. Sometimes with a specific reason, a question for the director, a detail about the renovation plans, and sometimes with no particular reason at all except that he was there, sitting in the family lounge with a cup of coffee, patient and unhurried, as though a hospital corridor were a perfectly reasonable place to spend an afternoon. He never pushed. He never pressed. He asked questions when she seemed open to them and sat in silence when she did not. And gradually, very gradually, the way temperature changes, the way seasons shift, too slowly to catch the exact moment of transition, Vivian found that she was beginning to look forward to his presence in a way that alarmed her considerably. She was not ready. She was certain of that. The ground she was standing on was still too recently shaken, the rubble of her previous life still too fresh around her feet. She did not trust herself, not her instincts, not her judgment, not after 7 years of missing something that, in retrospect, she could see had been in front of her the entire time. She told herself repeatedly that she was not going to make the same mistake twice. That warmth was not the same as trustworthiness. That attention was not the same as love. That a man who was kind to her now had no obligation to remain so. She told herself all of this with great conviction and full sincerity. And she still found herself, on a Wednesday afternoon, standing at the window of the family lounge with Elliot Graves, listening to him talk about his late wife Margaret with a quietness and an honesty that did not perform grief or package it for anyone else's comfort. That simply held it, plainly and without decoration, the way a person holds something that belongs to them. She learned the full story in pieces, the way you learn most things that matter. The first piece came from a colleague, a veteran nurse named Dorinda who had worked at St. Catherine's for over 20 years and had an encyclopedic memory for every patient who had passed through the palliative care unit. Dorinda was the one who mentioned, in passing, on a Thursday afternoon over bad cafeteria coffee, that she remembered a patient named Margaret Graves from about 4 years ago. A woman in her mid-40s, admitted in the spring, gone by the fall. Ovarian cancer, stage 4 at diagnosis. Exceptional woman, Dorinda said. Gracious and funny even at the end, the kind of patient who apologized for being a burden while she was actively dying. And the husband, Dorinda shook her head slightly at the memory, had barely left her side, had slept in the chair beside her bed more nights than not, had memorized her medication schedule and asked informed questions at every shift change, had been, in Dorinda's 37 years of nursing, one of the most devoted family members she had ever witnessed in that unit. Vivian listened to this and felt something she had not anticipated feeling, something that had no convenient name and was far too layered to be reduced to a single word. She thought about Elliot sitting in the family lounge. She thought about the way he talked about Margaret, not constantly, not in the overwhelming way of a man still swallowed by loss, but with a steadiness that suggested he had sat with his grief long enough to make a kind of peace with it. She thought about the fact that he had funded this renovation anonymously, or nearly so, without putting his name on a plaque or a press release, without making it a story about his generosity. He had simply written the check and walked in quietly and asked thoughtful questions about the patient's experience. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever he was doing in her vicinity was not a performance. It was just who he was. She told him, eventually, that she knew about Margaret. They were walking the length of the hospital's exterior garden on a quiet Friday afternoon. She was on her lunch break. He had arrived with no announced purpose. And she said it directly, because Vivian was not a person who did indirection well. I heard about your wife. I'm sorry. I think what you've done for this unit, what you've been doing, is something she would have been proud of. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of discomfort or deflection. The quiet of a man receiving something carefully. She was the one who always found the nurses to thank, he said finally. Every hospital stay, every treatment. She always knew their names. She thought it was the most important job in the building. He looked at Vivian. She was right. There was something in the air between them then that neither of them named or reached for. But it was there. Both of them felt it. And for the first time since that October night at the bus stop, Vivian Cole felt something shift in the careful, fortified architecture of her own heart. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Just enough. He appeared on a Tuesday morning, 43 days after the wedding that never happened. Vivian was finishing a 12-hour overnight shift when she walked out of the hospital's main entrance and found Daniel Whitfield standing on the sidewalk in a jacket she had bought him for his birthday, holding a coffee in each hand with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this scene in his mind and decided he was going to win it. He looked well-rested. He looked like a man who had processed the consequences of his actions and arrived at the conclusion that the cleanest solution was to undo them. He extended one of the coffees toward her. I know you probably don't want to hear this, he started. She stopped walking but did not take the coffee. But I've had a lot of time to think. And I know I made a terrible mistake. A terrible, inexcusable mistake. He paused, calibrating. But 7 years, Vivian. We built something real. I don't think that just disappears because of one bad decision. She looked at him for a long time. The exhaustion of a 12-hour overnight shift did not help her patience. But it sharpened her clarity considerably. The particular stripped-down clarity of a person too tired to maintain any performance, too depleted for anything but the plain truth. It wasn't one bad decision, Daniel, she said. It was 8 months of decisions, made over and over again, every single day. He opened his mouth. She continued. I know what you're going to say. I know the entire version of this conversation you've planned. And I want you to hear me very clearly when I tell you that there is nothing in that version that I haven't already thought about myself, in far more detail, at 4 in the morning, alone. She looked at the coffee in his hand. I hope things are well with you. I genuinely do. But this, whatever you came here to ask for, is not something I have to offer. Not now. Not ever. She walked past him through the parking lot without looking back, got into her car, and drove home. She cried for the first time since the night of the wedding. Not because she wanted him back, because she was finally, at 43 years old, grieving the version of her life she had spent 7 years building, not for him, but for herself. She let herself cry for the entire drive home. And when she got inside and sat down on her couch, she felt, not happiness, not relief exactly, but the first real breath she could remember taking in a very long time. She told Elliot about Daniel's visit on a Friday evening in December, sitting at a corner table in a small restaurant near the hospital where they had fallen into the habit of having dinner after her evening shift when their schedules aligned. She had not planned to tell him. It simply came out. The way things come out when you are with someone in whose presence you have gradually and almost accidentally stopped editing yourself. Elliot listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How are you feeling about it? Not how bad was it? Not what does this mean? Not the probing questions of a person trying to understand where they stand in relation to someone else's emotional landscape. Just, how are you feeling? She thought about it. Lighter, she said finally. Like I put something down that I've been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't part of me. He nodded slowly. That's what finally letting go feels like, he said. I know that feeling. She looked at him across the table. I know you do, she said. They were not in a rush. That was the thing about what grew between Vivian Cole and Elliot Graves. It moved at the pace of two people who had both experienced the kind of loss that teaches you not to take things for granted, and also not to treat permanence as a given, and also, paradoxically, not to let fear of impermanence keep you from trying. They had coffee, and they had evening walks, and they had long conversations about things that mattered and long silences about things that didn't need to be said, and somewhere in the accumulation of those ordinary hours, something built itself between them that neither of them had designed or planned or anticipated. It simply grew, the way things grow when the conditions are right, and both people have the wisdom to stop standing in the way. He told her, one evening in January, that he had not been to the cemetery since the previous spring and that he thought it was time to go, and he asked, quietly, if she would come with him. She said yes without hesitation. They stood at Margaret's grave on a cold, gray Saturday morning, and Elliot said the things you say to someone you loved and lost. In the plain, unself-conscious way, he did everything. And Vivian stood beside him in the quiet, and understood that this was the fullest version of the man she was standing next to, grief and all, and that she was not afraid of it. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. They stood there for a long time without speaking. And when they finally walked back to the car, she understood, without it needing to be announced, without a speech or a declaration, that something had shifted permanently between them. Something real had been witnessed and not flinched away from. And that was the foundation. On the first Saturday in March, 5 months after a rainy October night on Greenfield Avenue, Vivian Cole finished a long double shift at St. Catherine's Medical Center and walked out of the hospital's main entrance into a night that was cold and clear and laced with the particular smell of coming spring. She was tired in the good, deep way that comes from work that matters, from 14 hours of holding things together for people in the hardest moments of their lives. She stood on the pavement outside and breathed it in and felt, against all the odds of what the previous year had brought her, like someone who was genuinely and solidly okay. Not performing okay. Not carefully maintaining okay. Actually okay. She looked across the street. And at the bus stop on the opposite corner, the number 14 route stop, not Greenfield Avenue but the one nearest the hospital she had ridden dozens of times, there was a man sitting on the bench in a good coat, holding a paper cup in each hand, watching her with the steady, patient expression of a person who had arrived early and was entirely unbothered by the wait. Vivian stood on the pavement for a moment, looking at him across the street. Then she walked over. She sat down beside him. He held out one of the cups. She took it, looked at the logo on the side, a 24-hour diner 2 blocks east of the hospital, and felt something warm and helpless move through her chest. You know, she said, there's an actual cafe with good coffee inside the hospital. Elliot Graves looked straight ahead at the quiet street with the expression of a man trying and failing to conceal a smile. I know, he said. I checked before I sat down. She laughed. A full, unguarded laugh. The kind she had not known she was capable of anymore until it was already out of her, and it hung in the cold March air between them like something that had been waiting a very long time to exist. He looked at her when she laughed, and there was nothing performed in his expression, no charm, no calculation. Just a man looking at a woman he had come to know and admire and love in the slow, specific, irreplaceable way that real love actually accumulates, and being visibly and completely glad to be sitting next to her. She leaned back against the bench. He opened the umbrella he had apparently also thought to bring, the sky above them entirely clear and full of stars, and held it over both of them anyway. She looked up at the umbrella. She looked at him. It's not raining, Elliot. I know, he said. Old habit. She settled into the bench beside him, not closing any remaining distance in a dramatic gesture, not turning it into a moment. Simply settling in, letting it be what it was. Two people at a bus stop on a clear March night, holding bad diner coffee, with an umbrella open over their heads for no particular reason at all. And Vivian Cole, who had spent so many years holding everyone else up, who had given her steadiness and her patience and the best of her quiet, enormous heart to people who did not always deserve it. Finally, at 43 years old, on an ordinary street corner on an ordinary Saturday night, allowed herself to simply be held. Not saved, not rescued, not swept up in something that would eventually ask more than it gave. Just held, by someone who had earned it, by someone who had shown up again and again, without fanfare and without conditions, and sat down in the rain and waited. That, in the end, is the whole story. A woman who had everything planned and lost it in a single moment of shattering truth. A man who had built everything imaginable and still couldn't outrun the grief of what he'd lost. Two people, improbable and imperfect and both carrying more than they ever showed, who found each other at a bus stop in the rain on a night when everything was wrong, and chose, slowly and carefully and against every reasonable instinct they both had, to let something be right. Some things break you open not to destroy you, but to make room for what was always supposed to be there. Vivian Cole sat at that bus stop in October thinking her life was over. She was wrong. It was just, finally, beginning.